This ruling from the Supreme Court about Donald Trump has people in their feelings. And I really want to get into more details about this and what this could mean, because this ruling from SCOTUS isn't just applied to Donald Trump. This is a foreshadowing of what is going to happen down the line for other presidential candidates as well. Now, I want you to think about something as we go into the story. Do you agree with the SCOTUS ruling about giving Trump immunity over some acts? And I keep saying some because it wasn't all. We'll get into that. Or do you feel that this could become political? And that's what I want you to think about for just a second. We're going to start with this clip here from CNN, getting right into the SCOTUS ruling that Trump has immunity from official acts. So we have to pay attention to the vocabulary here. Let's dive in.
The Supreme Court has finally released its ruling on this long awaited case, saying that Trump has immunity from official acts. In several cases, they cite what official acts may be, but they also leave a number of others open for lower courts to make a final determination on. We're going to be talking a lot about the legal implications of all this. I want to first bring in CNN's Van Jones and Scott Jennings. Van, as you look at this, what stands out to you?
Well, it's a very concerning outcome. You know, there's a maxim that says in law, bad facts create bad law. So when you have somebody doing stuff that's so terrible, the stuff that Trump did in office, it creates these bad facts. The court has to come in and figure out what to do about it. It often creates bad law. Basically, the question is, Supreme Court, do you more care about the unlawful conduct of a sitting president or possibly the unfair prosecution of a former president? That's really what they had to balance. They're obviously more concerned about the latter. And so I think politically, it's bad. It makes the Supreme Court look very partisan. They're supposed to be wearing these kind of black and white umpire jerseys or whatever. They look like they're wearing red jerseys or even MAGA hats. It's going to go down bad politically for the Supreme Court.
Pause. So here's the thing about the Supreme Court being partisan. I don't remember the Supreme Court not being partisan, not in my adult life. As long as I can remember, the Supreme Court has always been partisan. So when Van Jones says it makes the Supreme Court look partisan, I don't remember them not being partisan. We've been saying for since Trump's presidency, that it's a conservative Supreme Court. We've talked about this before. We talked about the importance of having RBG step down so that Barack Obama could appoint a justice in her seat. We've talked about that before. So we have known for years that the Supreme Court is partisan. I don't understand why Van Jones is saying it now, that it makes the Supreme Court look like it's partisan now, when we have seen this for quite some time.
It's also scary because what is Trump going to do if Trump gets elected? And there's this idea that he can get away with even more stuff. That's really, really scary for the public because he already ran over every norm that he could. So it seems like, I'm looking at this politically, not legally, politically, it's almost like a license to thug in a way. Like, you can do whatever you want, and the Supreme Court is probably going to let you get away with it. That is very frightening in this case. And so I'm very, very concerned.
Pause. So this whole thing about the Supreme Court letting the president get away with what they want, I think we need to reframe this. Number one, there is an impeachment process, and it's there for a reason. So if Donald Trump is elected and representatives feel that he is behaving or acting in a way that is not suitable for a president to behave, they can always file impeachment papers. They can always file that. That is what impeachment is there for. But this idea that the Supreme Court should just be able to come in and tell the president whether or not they can be immune or not, I think that's a dangerous thing, because let's flip the people. Let's pretend it wasn't Donald Trump. Let's pretend it was Joe Biden. It's a conservative court. Would they have ruled the same if it was Joe Biden and not Donald Trump? So what you end up happening is that this makes it more political. And that's what I want people to really focus on about this particular ruling. It makes it political because now the Supreme Court is going to obviously side with their party. So in reference to holding the president accountable, unfortunately, at this point in time, what we do have in place is the impeachment process. It is not perfect, but that is what Congress is there for. They're supposed to be the ones to bring that forward, which they could still do if Donald Trump were to win. And I want you to think about this as well. If it happened to be Joe Biden, would Van Jones and Anderson Cooper be upset about the ruling if it was Joe Biden? Something to think about.
Scott Jennings, Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, essentially makes that argument, saying the main takeaway of today's decision is that all of a president's official acts defined without regard to motive or intent are entitled to immunity that is at least presumptive and quite possibly absolute.
Yeah, look, I think there's some amount of overreaction here. I mean, after all, they did kick it back down to the lower court, so some decisions could be made about differentiating between official and private acts. But look, this court has stood up for the office of the presidency and the executive power of the presidency in a way that, may be of some benefit to future presidents. I mean, we're looking at this through the lens of Donald Trump, but, the president of the United States has a lot of power for a reason. And they do take a lot of official actions. And I think about a future where, if it was open season on presidents for time immemorial, what action would any president ever take out of fear of being dragged into a courtroom every time they did it? So I hear Van, and I think there's interesting arguments on both sides of this today. I've listened to some of arguments like what Van has made. But at the same time, I do think the office deserves a lot of protection and a lot of deference because of the special place that it holds in our system. So I'm okay with it, especially because I think a lower court may have decisions to make in the future, of course, depending on the outcome of the election in November.
But Van, just to be clear, even if a lower court makes a ruling, then that can, because what the Supreme Court says is that can be appealed ultimately back to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, look, I think the Supreme Court is really hurting itself here. I mean, I think most Americans on either side would have preferred us getting some kind of finality around these cases. And what you see is the Supreme Court just dragging this out and dragging this out. They could have weighed in on all this stuff back in March and cleared the decks on this one way or the other. They didn't. They say, go through the whole process and you come back up here. Then they wait 60 plus days past the buzzer to give us this decision. The way it's structured, this thing is going to ping pong back and forth for 3 or 4 more years, maybe. It seems like they're doing Donald Trump a favor when they don't have to. The ruling does seem to be much more concerned about unleashing the presidency than constraining the presidency. That's fine, except that there's a different balance here. Now you're concerned about a renegade president. Are you concerned about a renegade president prosecuting someone unfairly after the fact or acting like a rogue or a thug in office? It's not clear what's the greater threat to the republic, and it doesn't seem like the majority really has taken as seriously the concern of half the country about renegade presidencies in the office. I think the Supreme Court is hurting itself. There was, I believe, a way to come to a better outcome, a quicker outcome, an outcome that better balances the interests here. What I think people are going to take away from this, Donald Trump has a Supreme Court that will let him do whatever he wants to, and that is terrifying.
Anderson, if I may,
let me pause here for just a second. So again, I think what Van Jones is forgetting or omitting is that we have an impeachment process. That is where Congress is supposed to make the right decision here and bring forth impeachment. And it's been done before. This isn't new. I mean, think about Bill Clinton. How many of you were around during the Bill Clinton days and the Monica Lewinsky and all that jazz, right? What happened? Impeachment was filed. Now, impeachment doesn't mean that you are removed from office, but it's a first step to try to remove a president from office. So what I worry about with the Supreme Court here with this particular case, you have to think about this as a nonpartisan thing. So if you hate Trump, it's going to be easy to say, this is ridiculous, this isn't right. If you like Trump, it's going to be easier for you to say, hell yeah, this is great for Trump. But I want you to pretend it's not Donald Trump, because this really can set a precedent for other presidents in the future. So that's how I want you to think about it. Does the Supreme Court have, or should they have, that authority to make these decisions about a sitting president? And the reality is, a sitting president or former president or a president that's trying to run for presidency again. But the reality is, at the end of the day, I feel like we are heading down a dangerous path in this country. I feel like there's too much power being concentrated in one area, and so much to the point that now you'll start to notice the Supreme Court is actually starting to throw things back to the lower courts, bringing things back to the states. We'll get into that in just a second, but I want people to not look at this as a partisan way. Just pretend it's not Donald Trump. Just pretend it's someone named Rogue or something like that. And think about how it will be applied in the future. So that's what I want people to focus on. And that can kind of be hard to do, right? Now, someone did do that, though. Someone did do that. Oh, do I want to get to that one yet? Do I want to get to Jonathan's article? Yeah, let's go to Jonathan's article first. Jonathan Turley. I want to bring up this article here by him, because Jonathan Turley is not a Trump supporter. He's a legal expert. He did not support Trump, but apparently, so, you know, like I guess the MAGA people don't really like him, but at the same time, liberals are also mad at him. So he's just not in a happy space between both parties. I guess you would say he's kind of in the middle, and you may have seen him before, but let's break this down, because President Joe Biden said that the Supreme Court basically removed all limits or whatever. And Jonathan Turley is going to explain to you that is not actually the case. No, President Biden, the Supreme Court did not remove all limits on the presidency. See, I saw a number of people get this wrong the other day. So let's get into this here. President Biden delivered an address from the White House last night on presidential immunity decision by the Supreme Court, while pledging that he will defend the rule of law. President Biden misrepresented what that law is in the aftermath of Trump versus the U.S. While we have often discussed false constitutional claims by the president, as well as other false statements, an address of this kind is particularly concerning and misleading citizens. Let's get to this part here. Okay. This was the statement from Biden. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what the president can do. That is not true. The court found that there was absolute immunity for actions that fall within their exclusive sphere of constitutional authority, while they enjoy presumptive immunity for other official acts. They do not enjoy immunity for unofficial or private actions. That's why I said we have to pay attention to the vocabulary. That's important. The court has often adopted tiered approaches in balancing the powers of branches. He gives an example there. We ain't gonna get into all of that. But it says the court separated cases into actions taken in core areas of effective authority, official actions taken outside those core areas, and unofficial actions. Actions deemed personal or unofficial are not protected under this ruling. It is certainly true that the case affords considerable immunity, including for conversations with subordinates. Let me go down here. President Biden's hyperventilated response is crushingly ironic. He was vice president when Obama killed an American citizen without a trial or a charge. When former Attorney General Eric Holder announced the kill list policy, he was met with applause, not condemnation. The Biden-Obama administration then fought every effort by the family to sue the government. President Biden would have been outraged by any attempt of a Republican district attorney to charge him or Obama with murder. He also would be outraged by prosecutors pursuing criminal charges for the death associated with the deluge of undocumented persons over the southern border. In his address, President Biden also claimed that the law would no longer define the limits of the presidency. This is also untrue. This case was remanded for the purpose of defining what of these functions would be deemed private as opposed to official. Even on official actions, former President Donald Trump could be prosecuted if the presumptive immunity is rebutted by prosecutors. So does everybody see this part here? We're going to highlight it because there was a narrative that went around the other day where people were saying that he was immune from everything. He's not immune from all actions. So when it comes to official actions, he can still be prosecuted. Let's go on. What was most glaring for many civil libertarians was President Biden's portrayal of himself as a paragon of constitutional fealty. He declared that I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers as I have for the last 3.5 years. That was also untrue. President Biden has racked up an impressive array of losses in federal courts where he was found to have violated the Constitution. This includes rulings that his administration has exceeded his authority and engaged in racial discrimination in federal programs. Indeed, Biden has often displayed a cavalier attitude towards such violations. Let's go forward here. While some of us have challenged these predictions, the other presidential candidates are missing a far more compelling argument going into this election. While democracy is not on the ballot this election, free speech is. I thought that was an important part that he said there. So this is coming from Jonathan Turley. Again, some people think he's Republican. Jonathan Turley said he did not support Donald Trump and he doesn't support Donald Trump now. So it's kind of like, it's interesting. He's had both sides mad at him. I guess he's kind of a little bit more in the middle. So I think that's important for people to fully understand. So again, Trump has not received full immunity for all of these acts. Now, let's talk about possible solutions when it comes to the Supreme Court, because one of the things that has been proposed multiple times is the idea of expanding the Supreme Court or term limits, damn it. Now, some of you I know don't agree with expanding the Supreme Court, but how about term limits? Because think about it this way. Supreme Court justices are granted a lifetime employment, lifetime appointment. Are you given a lifetime appointment at your job? You can lose your job tomorrow. Most people do not have a lifetime appointment. But when it comes to the Supreme Court justices, they are given a lifetime appointment. I have never agreed with that. I've always thought that that should not be the case. So term limits could be a way to change this. And maybe not just with the Supreme Court, but with Congress as well, damn it. Let's think about it, okay? But Joe Biden's against reforming the Supreme Court. So as much as Joe Biden gave that speech and he complained about what has happened with Donald Trump and the immunity, Joe Biden doesn't want to prevent this from happening in the future, because peep this, fam. Now, Rolling Stone released this yesterday. Biden campaign brushes off the idea of reforming the Supreme Court. Now, you think about all the things that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Biden administration have complained about that the Supreme Court has passed, in particular, removing Roe v. Wade and putting that back to the states, right? You would think that while he is in that position of power, he would try to reform the Supreme Court. Why doesn't he want to do that? This is why I call the bluff, guys. If you're in that position where you can do that, why do you not want to do that? Don't want to get rid of the lifetime appointments? Don't want to expand the court? So you're not really trying to make a change here when it comes to the Supreme Court. And I'll just read a little bit of this here. It says here, he could issue an edict that all digital or physical evidence of his debate performance last week be destroyed, or he could just use this chilling partisan decision, that latest 6-3 ruling in a term that was characterized by a staggering number of them, as an opportunity to finally embrace the movement to reform the Supreme Court. But Biden is not planning to do any of that. Shortly after SCOTUS delivered its decision on Trump versus the U.S., Biden campaign held a press call with surrogates. And it goes on to say here, their message was simple. It's terrifying to contemplate what Donald Trump might do with these powers if he's reelected. We have to do everything in our power to stop him, everything that is, except to take material action to rein in the increasingly lawless and openly right-wing Supreme Court. So again, if Joe Biden were serious, this is something that he could do. And I don't see what would be wrong with that. I mean, come on, like I said, you don't get a lifetime appointment for other jobs. Either expand the Supreme Court or remove the lifetime appointments. You got to do something here. But he doesn't want to because Joe Biden is not serious. Now, I want to remind you of something, because I have not forgotten about this. When you think about how conservative the Supreme Court is, and when you think about some of the decisions, some of the rulings that the Supreme Court has made, in particular in the past week or so, and also going back to the Roe v. Wade decision, I just want to remind you of something. Not all of those justices that are there were appointed by Donald Trump. Not all the conservative justices. Because there's one justice, Clarence Thomas, that I strongly feel would not have been there had it not been for Joe Biden. And I want to remind you of this. As you hear SCOTUS rulings this week, don't forget that Clarence Thomas probably wouldn't be there if Biden would have allowed Anita Hill's witnesses to testify. Don't forget about that, ladies and gentlemen. Because see, some people do, and I don't. Let's all remember, let's go back to when Biden was Senator Biden. Anita Hill had evidence against Clarence Thomas. She also had witnesses that were willing to testify against Clarence Thomas. Senator Biden at that point in time was the chairman of the committee. He was the one that refused to allow her witnesses to testify. And if that would have happened, who knows where we would be today? And I'm willing to bet that if those witnesses would have been heard, if they would have been allowed to testify, I'm willing to bet that Clarence Thomas would not be sitting on the Supreme Court. So one of those conservative justices, you have Joe Biden to thank for that. Then what made it really sad is when he was running for president in 2020, he had to make a phone call to Anita Hill and ask for her support. Ain't that some shit? Isn't that a way to just wag your tail in between? You just had to go back to the person that you disrespected during that time. And if you go back and you watch the video footage, Joe Biden was completely nasty towards Anita Hill. Let's remember that. So I always like to bring that up. We will have to see what happens with the Trump situation, but I don't want us to be distracted. I don't want us to just be focused on it's Donald Trump, so he has to go down. I want you to think about how this is going to affect other presidents in the future. I personally don't think the Supreme Court should be involved with the president in this way. I think it will be very political. I think that is not going to be fair. not as that we have a fair justice system anyway, but who is going to hold the president accountable? We have to start thinking about that. The country's a mess. And something else as well. What has been happening with the Supreme Court, I hope this is going to push people to pay closer attention to what's happening in your state at the lower courts. And I bring this up because when we covered the story about SCOTUS, that they decided to agree with the Biden administration that the government has a right to tell social media companies what they can and cannot do or post or whatever, takes you back to the Twitter files. Well, there's an update about that particular story, which is that now the Supreme Court has decided that those two particular social media cases that they had that were brought forth to the Supreme Court, they decided to throw it back to the states. And I'll show you an example here. It says state laws on social media moderation are too vague, Supreme Court says. But then it says here, the Supreme Court is pushing back to lower courts two key cases looking how social media companies moderate content on their platforms and how states respond to it. Now that's Texas and Florida, those particular cases there. But I hope what this is going to push people to do is to pay attention to what is happening in your state. I know it's not sexy. Okay, I know it's not an attractive topic. A lot of people focus on what's happening on the federal level and they're not paying attention to what's happening on the local level. But notice the trend that is happening. Roe v. Wade was overturned and the Supreme Court pushed it back to the states. This social media case from Texas and Florida, the Supreme Court pushed it back to the states. And I think you're going to see this happen more and more. And what that means is that you're going to have to start paying attention to what's happening in your state. This is why I talk about the ballot measures and the ballot initiatives. This is why I cover some of the local stories, because although you may not live in that city where it's happening or that state where it's happening, it could be coming to your state. And then I hope what this will sincerely do is to motivate people to organize locally in your state to get things done. Again, not pretty, not attractive. It isn't. But that is where I feel like that's an untapped resource for a lot of people. A lot of people put their hope in electoral politics on the national level. How many people know who their city councilors are? How many people go to the meetings that their mayors have or the city council meetings in the evening? How many people know who is actually representing them on a local level? So hopefully this will push people to organize more in the states on the local level, which is something that I do. I think you're going to see more and more of this.